4 years. What is often ignored in our society, and that is the contribution of ordinary people who, because of passion and belief in the equality and justice for all, have maintained a struggle that precedes even those of us who are in this room. I'm really, really proud to say that Jack Drado is one of my heroes. We are contemporaries, but for those of you who do not know this, Jack Drado was one of the primary agitators of our community back in the 60s and the 70s. And I say that because even then, when we were just beginning to organize ourselves as a force to be reckoned with, Jack Drado and Jose Villa were the ones who called together the community every single Friday afternoon to sit around the round table in Maxa and to plot the way in which we were going to define ourselves, protect ourselves, and identify the prices in our community and in ourselves. But we are here because Gabriel Thompson is here and because Fred Ross Jr. is here. And let me just tell you that when my son Jaime and I met Gabriel Thompson recently, this past July, there is absolutely no way that I could have understood at that time how timely his visit would be for us and with us. There was no way that we could have known the outcome of this distressing election. There was no way that we could have known that we needed tonight to be together. That the work that Fred Ross did in this community resonates with so many of us, and we still bear it within ourselves as a time of community organizing that was unparalleled, because out of the efforts of Fred Ross came the likes of our great hero, Cesar Chavez, who established the CSOs throughout California and the Southwest, and who even to this day reminds us that organizing community is a sacred duty that we all have. And you know, I was thinking about Martin Luther King, and one of his comments was, "Only in the darkness can we see the stars." And I really feel that today we are here we are the stars. We are the ones that will illuminate the path, and it is our responsibility and our duty. Because as Cesar Chavez said, it is how we live our lives that determines the kind of persons that we are.
Out of that. And they were domestic workers and they were farm workers. And it was very simple why they were written out of that. It was because in the South, most blacks worked as farm workers or domestic workers. And so Southern Congress people said, we will not support these bills granting all these union rights to workers if they apply to the black people that live amongst us. And so as a compromise, they were written out of those bills. In 1975, through the UFW's advocacy, and in fact I think their main lawyer actually wrote the bill, they passed what's called the Agricultural Labor Relations Act in California. Brown, then and now Governor Brown, signed it, which gave farm workers suddenly the right to have the right to form unions and to be protected, to have that right to be protected. To this date, California is the only state in the country that has that in place. And what had happened is that when this bill passed, there was an explosion of activity, of democracy in the fields, essentially, where all these workers who had been written out of this democratic process were petitioning for elections, and it was, I mean, the UFW was stretched thin because they're being called every which way across the state, and very quickly the money ran out to oversee that process because the demand was so high. And so Proposition 14 was a way to try to make sure that the state would guarantee funding for that board, to make sure that lack of money didn't keep farm workers from being able to have elections. It gets more complicated, but that was the gist of Proposition 14.
undocumented students in front of Sproul Hall who were carrying a banner that said, "Undocumented, unafraid." So this generation gives me hope. And on Cesar Chavez's birthday, I'm often asked to come speak to the class, and so when the kids were in junior high, I'd go to speak, and I knew the kids were wondering, what the hell is this little man got to tell us? So I had to make real quick, how do we get their attention? So I said, well, I've been doing this a few years, and during that time, I've had a lot of fun. I tell them, I've been shot at once. Gasp. Did it hit you? Luckily, it was a bad shot. I've been knocked unconscious by a grape grower in the Coachella Valley, and I've been arrested 37 times, mostly for good causes. I want to lift up just a couple of stories, then open up for questions.
Please go ahead.
When you talked about oral history, I just really have so much respect for that and encourage everyone to tell your story. About 10 years ago, I got a call from a documentarian in Orange County. And she said, I understand that your father was involved in the Mendez case, Mendez versus Westminster. And I said, really? I said, who told you that? She said, well, a man by the name of Hector Tarango. I said, oh, okay. So for my dad's 75th birthday, Cesar and I did a party for him. We did a book on his life, interviewed him, and I looked it up and I said, sure enough, there was Hector Tarango mentioned, but nothing about this case. But Hector had helped do a registration route. So I called Tarango, and by this time he's in his 80s. I sure do, yeah. So I took him down to Orange County. He takes me into his garage, and he's still got the papers. This is the story he tells. He said we had just come back from World War II, a few of us. We formed LULAC and other organizations. Your dad came in, and we began to do several things. He said we registered people to vote. We helped people become citizens. We fought for better schools for our kids. And then we decided we better have representation on that school board, so we found a local barber to run for the school board, and he won. And then what happened is the district attorney called us in, a few of the leaders, and the local Catholic bishop was there. And the DA said, listen, I know you're well-meaning people, but you're being used by this Fred Ross. And he pulled out these letters with Hollywood actors who were then later Edward G. Roberts said, oh, this is the bad crowd, so you're being used. Well, Tarango was a Baptist, so he wasn't intimidated by the bishop. He was the only one who stood up to, wait a minute, what is un-American about wanting better schools for our kids? What's un-American about registering to vote and getting people out to vote? Or finding someone to run for the board? Or helping people become citizens? But the DA wouldn't hear it. A year later, my father was in Lincoln Heights, East LA. They're having the founding convention of the CSO there. He invited Hector up for dinner. He said, Hector, I learned 2 lessons, important lessons from that failure, because he considered it a failure. Because it was thrown out, right? People got scared. He says, from now on, before I go into a new community, I meet with the local Catholic bishop. And I meet with the district attorney. So he learned those lessons. He didn't know that he planted these seeds that led to the historic desegregation case. So you never know when or where you're planting those seeds. And just the other night, Sunday before the election, I got a call from Jamie Juarez, who's a young organizer that I've trained and mentored. She had just been going door to door in a little town called Guadalupe, Arizona, just south of Tempe. And I said, did you go to the Garcia household? And I had the address. The reason I asked is Laura and Margie Garcia were a young couple in Guadalupe at that time, and my dad went down to train to become organizers. When I was 16 that year, I went down to spend several weeks with my dad. And I was joking last night. I said, this is the era of the mimeograph machine. Some of you remember the mimeograph? Well, I remember hours of doing postcards through the mimeograph before we sent out for the meeting. But that's when I first saw what my father was doing. I had this vague notion that he was helping poor people. And we had been raised that racial prejudice was the worst thing you could do. And as a matter of fact, my sister, brother, and I shamed my grandmother, Daisy. I said, is it true that you're prejudiced against Negroes, we'd ask her? Oh, no, she said. You heard that earlier story. But in Guadalupe, what I saw as I went around with Dad to these meetings, was how men and women who've been discarded, who have been disrespected, have been ignored, began to come together in small house meetings, began to talk about the issues and the hurt and the pain and disrespect and what they might do about it. They began, their imaginations were stirred. What can we do? They registered 897 new people to vote for the community, that Yaqui Indian Mexican-American community. And the Republican member of the Board of Supervisors refused to meet with them until they had 897 new voters, and he was up for re-election. So one summer night in this little desert town, in a schoolyard outside, they had their first candidates night for the newly formed GO organization for the Guadalupe organization. Vámonos, go. So this guy comes out, and he's like the white hair, white shoes, white belt. I thought, this guy's not going to say anything good. No, but he came to report on what he'd been able to accomplish. He'd made promises. So the first 30 stop signs were actually up in the community. The first stoplight for this very dangerous 2-lane highway through the community had been put up. He made some new promises. He says, I'll make sure that you get a new post office because folks have to go to the liquor store to get their mail. You can hire someone from your community to be the local member of the sheriff's department. So I was seeing democracy at its best in action as a 16-year-old, and that hooked me. And so at 21, I went to work full-time as one of those $5 a week volunteers at Cesar Chavez. And that changed my life too. When I was thinking, although my father was not fluent in Spanish, he knew the dichos. And I think one of the dichos he would have been remembering last Tuesday night is the one about no hay mal que por bien no venga. Que no? Someone said earlier about hope. It's in the darkest times that we need to find that hope. And whether it's in our kids, our grandkids, or deep inside ourselves, that what we're ready to do. You may have been thinking about retiring, but this is no time to retire. It's time to get back on the battlefield if we've been away, right? That's part of the inspiration of my father. He was a long-distance runner for justice. He and Cesar and Dolores and Gilbert Padilla and others. Finished the story on Durango. I told that story to both Gilbert Padilla and Herman Gallegos. And they were doing this oral history project for the CSO volunteers. So they went down and they have Hector Durango's oral history. And then they approached the National Council of La Raza, and at 85, about 2 years before he died, Hector Durango was honored at a national convention of the National Council of La Raza. That's a great example of one of the unknown heroes being honored and recognized. And that's what I love about the book that Gabriel has written. And I'd like to just read one thing that I think is also appropriate for what's happening today in the environment that we're in. It is the second week of January in 1945. Ross is driving from Cleveland to California, accompanied by 2 Japanese American men. The U.S. government had evacuated ethnic Japanese from the West Coast during World War II, and Ross's 2 companions are among the first to legally return. They crossed into Southern California on Highway 10 and stopped for the night in Indio, a dusty desert city near Palm Springs. When they walk into a crowded restaurant, the room falls silent. After they take their seats, several burly men stand up and walk over, staring with hatred. Another man picks up the phone, calls the police, loudly reporting that a couple of Japs have walked through the door and predicting trouble. Ross hurries the men outside. Back at the motel, Ross gathers what he calls his propaganda, pamphlets and flyers that document the bravery of Japanese Americans who have volunteered for the Army. He returns to the restaurant alone, armed with these papers, and proceeds to explain to the men, not all of whom are sober, that the Japanese are now welcome on the West Coast and that many fought honorably for their country. He stays until the men seem to agree with him. Then he picks up 3 meals and returns to the motel. And then Gabriel writes this: What struck me about this story? The first, of course, was the measure of bravery involved in the act of returning to the restaurant. I would have not done so. Much easier to cut my losses and go somewhere else, especially since no one was there to judge. But more fundamental was what the decision to return revealed about how Ross thought about people. It only made sense to return if he believed that men threatening violence in one moment could be convinced that they were wrong in the next. I want to go to my mom, and she said, she's about 84 by this time. You're damn right we can. She was a proud Rose and Riveter in Cleveland, Ohio. She went to the war factory. She was a pioneer in community mental health. She was a pioneer in breaking through the stenography pool in Sacramento, first paid lobbyist in Sacramento for social justice causes. So it was not an accident that my dad had the good common sense to go out and make sure he was finding the women to be leaders early on. That's part of this story as well. I was my mom's feet in the 1964 election. A guy named Goldwater was running for president, and Johnson. My mom was the precinct captain. She needed me to go door to door and report back. Big victory. The next morning, I'm off to high school, and I look across the street. We're getting in the car. Our neighbor had put up a big sign that said, "God, please help us save our republic." And on my mom's side, I'm Irish, so I had the short temper. So I went over and I grabbed that sign and I threw it in the trunk. Come home from school that afternoon, and not thinking about it. There's two cops at the door, and they say, "Your neighbor thinks you stole a sign this morning. Is that true?" I said, "Yes, it's true." They said, "Well, you have two choices. You can come with us to juvenile hall, or your neighbor wants to talk to you about his philosophy." Guess which I chose? I heard all about the John Birch Society and how our country was going red. As you can tell, he didn't persuade me. I was raised by my mom and my dad, but it was my first encounter with the law before I ever got arrested. So thank you. Let's open up the questions.
Why don't we open it up to the floor, maybe ask about 3 or 4 questions and not more than that. So who wants to go first? I think Shirley?
Yeah, I don't kind of a question more than a comment. 2 stories, Fred Ross stories. I went to his memorial service at Delancey Street in San Francisco. Cesar Chavez was very, very sick that day. And he took these letters that Fred Ross had written him over the many years that they communicated. And he started in his really coughy, sick voice to read some of the stories. And one of the stories was, "Dear Cesar, last I heard from you, you're kind of upset that things aren't going well." And, he just encourages him throughout these letters that Cesar's reading. And at the end of the letter, he says, "Here's $1." Every letter he sent Cesar $1. It was just an amazing human story. The second story is that Fred Ross Jr. was the organizer of the biggest ranch in Salinas and Arizona Valley, which is called the Bruce Church Company. And I was with the ALRB at the time, and I worked there for many, many years. And one of the things that happened was that we had agreed that we would follow the buses with the farm workers to make sure that they were taken to the right place to vote. Well, these buses were running circles around us, the ALRB agents, and I could see Fred from one of the state cars, and this bus is going by, and I tell him, "Let's beat the bus." What would Fred do? What would Cesar do? Ran off the bus, and I got in front of the bus so that it wouldn't go anywhere. And it stopped, barely missed me, right? And so, the organizing that he taught us what to do, not to be afraid to stand in front of buses. Would I do it again today? Yes, I would do it. Because we need to do those kinds of things to fight that stuff that's going on, the racism, the sexism, everything that's going on today. We got to start and stand in front of buses.
Okay.
Because I love black and white photography, and I was wondering, Dorothea Lange did a lot of photographing of the Dust Bowl, and I was wondering if she captured any photos of Fred Ross.
Late Santa Cruz named Sima Weatherwax. And in 40 and 41, she traveled through, she went to a number of the federal labor camps, including where Ross was. And so the cover photo here, it might be kind of hard to see, but it's a little incomplete, it's cropped, but that's Ross with Woody Guthrie at one of those camps, and she took a series of photos there of Guthrie playing music and of Ross doing his work. But those are the only ones that I ever found of kind of skilled photographs of him.
And as a child that didn't grow up with my father when he was involved, it's great for me to hear the stories, because they're stories for me. And I saw that you have your social media page. What's your tour? What's your plan? How are you distributing and disseminating the information? Do you have organizers giving the talks, or what are you going to do?
The book came out in March, so
Go ahead.
what's that?
Go ahead.
Oh, well, there's something. Fred has been a huge, he happens to also be an organizer. And so he and I both have done maybe, 20, 25 events around. We were just in DC, gave a talk at the Department of Labor, at the AFL-CIO. We did a big event in Fresno, did an event in Santa Cruz. And a lot of those events, which I think is special, is that they are with people who are organizing in the field right now to talk about what things you might, both what lessons you might find helpful, and also what stumbling blocks that Ross encountered in his life and in his personal life. So I think we've done quite a few events. And I try to crank out articles and pieces when they present themselves. But I think the real, as opposed to a lot of book tours where you just go to bookstores and you hope people come, I'm really driven by people who either knew about Ross and cared about him, or were organizers and had always known something about Fred Ross and wanted to learn more. And so we go in and actually, at least once before we did a big community gathering, we sat down with some of the key leaders of the organization so that they could kind of hash out in small conversations some of the reflections they took from the book. So
do you have bookstores, guys?
we have books, yeah.
I'd like to close the discussion by giving a local angle. Blanca Alvarado has been here for a very, very long time, since 1945. She knew Fred Ross, so why don't you tell us about your observations?
Well, I can only say, at my age, memory is a little bit unreliable. But I was a young bride living in the Mayfair district when I first met Fred Ross. And your dad, I like to tell the story that we should have a historical plaque put on our garage on Sunset, which is where my son and my daughter-in-law live, because that is one of the places where they had a brief organizing meeting for CSO. And so I think when I met you, Gabriel, and one of the reasons why we were anxious to attend your event in July is because a certain amount of nostalgia just erupted when he told me that you were going to this town. And I think all of us feel that because we are connected to you through the past that we have all shared and lived. And all I can say, Gregorio, is that when I was, like I say, a young bride, I was just starting my family there in the Mayfair area, I had no idea that Fred Ross would be such an amazing force for good in our little community and certainly throughout California and the Southwest. And you said it just a moment ago, the lessons that we learned by your presentation and by your book, and by resurfacing the legacy of Fred Ross is absolutely timely, because there are so many examples already in the community of organizing taking place. And one way, the Fred Ross way, is already happening to some degree with Chava Bustamante and his organization called Luna. But there is the social media. There are so many ways in which we can mobilize that were not present when your father was out there, your father was out doing the door-to-door knocking. But that system of direct contact with people, you're right, it is such an improvement. It is so much more effective than these quick little tweeters that go out. I think that there are, Fernando wanted to ask a question.
I was just wondering, how do you fund all of this? You have to have a car, you have to have gas, you have to eat, you have to stay in hotels. How did you, or your dad, how did they do this?
Well, Saul Alinsky heard about my dad when he was fundraising. He was playing cards, this is like 1946, 47. Shortly after that organizing drive that Gabriel described. And the guy he was trying to raise money from was bitterly complaining about this guy, Fred Ross, who's, instead of doing a study on race relations, is stirring up a hell of a lot of trouble. And Alinsky said, "Tell me his name again." And then he wrote to my father. They met in East LA, and my dad realized that there were 500,000 Mexican Americans in East LA at the time, the largest concentration outside of Mexico City. The Negro community had the NAACP, Japanese Americans had JECL, but there was not a militant fighting community organization for the Chicanos, for Mexican Americans. So my dad said, "I want to organize here." Alinsky wanted to have him go organize coal miners up in Butte. My dad said, "Nothing doing." So Alinsky raised the money. It wasn't much, and luckily my mom knew how to, scrimp and save. But that's how it was paid. And then the members of the CSO began to pay dues.
Right.
That was the other way. But they'd raise money for foundations and so forth. And it was, and that's, got a car. And Foster Freeze, my dad loved milkshakes. And the last thing was, he always advised us organizers to do it with animo. And one morning I was leading a meeting for one of the candidates, and all of a sudden I hear in the back of the room, "Animo!" Because I wasn't doing it with animo. So I had to, it's like having a great coach in the back saying, get going. So it was like a little wake-up call. Well, Saul Alinsky heard about my dad when he was fundraising. He was playing cards, this is like 1946, 47. Shortly after that organizing drive that Gabriel described. And the guy he was trying to raise money from was bitterly complaining about this guy, Fred Ross, who's, instead of doing a study on race relations, is stirring up a hell of a lot of trouble. And Alinsky said, "Tell me his name again." And then he wrote to my father. They met in East LA, and my dad realized that there were 500,000 Mexican Americans in East LA at the time, the largest concentration outside of Mexico City. The Negro community had the NAACP, Japanese Americans had JECL, but there was not a militant fighting community organization for the Chicanos, for Mexican Americans. So my dad said, "I want to organize here." Alinsky wanted to have him go organize coal miners up in Butte. My dad said, "Nothing doing." So Alinsky raised the money. It wasn't much, and luckily my mom knew how to, scrimp and save. But that's how it was paid. And then the members of the CSO began to pay dues.
Right.
That was the other way. But they'd raise money for foundations and so forth. And it was, and that's, got a car. And Foster Freeze, my dad loved milkshakes. And the last thing was, he always advised us organizers to do it with animo. And one morning I was leading a meeting for one of the candidates, and all of a sudden I hear in the back of the room, Animo! Because I wasn't doing it with animo. So I had to, it's like having a great coach in the back saying, get going. So it was like a little wake-up call.
Did your father work with Ernesto Galarza at all? And any history? Did you see anything in the writings or the research that you've done, if there was any kind of
I
interaction?
know that they knew each other, there was tremendous mutual respect. I don't know details if they actually worked together on these projects.
They did meet a few times in San Jose.
Yeah.
You did,
So,
okay.
yeah.
Sal Alinsky did work with him, so I was wondering, given the connection of the question there,
Right,
if
right.
that was the case.
And the modern day connection is Chava Bustamante.
Yes, yes.
My father trained Chava.
Yeah,
So when I
yeah.
saw Chava get arrested a couple months ago, I said, way to go. And I wrote a little note.
Okay,
Real quick, did you know
close.
Sophia Mendoza?
Yes.
Did you
Yes,
talk
I did.
much about Sophia Mendoza?
Yes.
Could you talk about
Just
her?
tremendous respect for her and the work that she did.
Okay, we're gonna close this presentation. I'd like to thank on behalf of the Raza Historical Society, Valle Santa Clara, Gabriel, thanks for coming.
And there are books over there.
Okay, don't run away, we're not leaving, don't run away, we're still just trying to make some time. Stay here, we want your picture, this is a historic occasion, take all the beautiful pictures you want, because we'll be asking you for donations for them. Thank you. Okay. Marcy Mora has picked the name.